So this is a somewhat shorter week that really builds on last week. And I want to start with the full disclosure. I might have mentioned it in passing last week, and I'll probably mention again. So I was brought up in the Assemblies of God, which is one of these Pentecostal denominations. I was in middle school when this Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker scandals that you'll learn about in this unit took place. And currently, I would consider myself something of a Pentecostal Anglican. Um, I mentioned that because really, I think Bloom um, has a skewed view of Pentecostals. I think he takes an unfair approach to them generally, and the Assemblies of God in particular. Um, as we discussed in the previous module, Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement are international phenomena with international roots. To assume that they're the core, at their core American, is to misunderstand them entirely. Um, Bloom's error, quite frankly, rests in his infatuation with Swaggart. Uh, why he would not assume that the experience of his opening paragraph um, of chapter 10 on page 171 is not the norm, I don't know. Um, it would seem to me that experience in that Hispanic Pentecostal service, which he described as humbling, an experience of authentic forces that seem to emerge from the recess of being, why wouldn't he think that experience was more defining of the Pentecostal movement? And instead, he sees Swaggart, a true American showman, and I will give him that. Swaggart is quite the showman. And in a different vein, so are Baker, Jim and Tammy Baker. Um, but if Swaggart is the norm at the heart of this movement, then his claim that they are purely American would probably be true. Um, Swaggart and Baker are both truly American. I mean, Heritage USA was the name of the PTL organization. Their kind of their vacation spot that they developed. We'll talk about that later. Um, but it's that point that I think that Bloom is wrong, that he's incorrect. The movement as a whole is really not defined by Swaggart or Baker, and in fact, both of them had come out of the Assemblies of God. But interestingly, before the the scandals, before the everything was known, before the affairs, before all of that, both of them had already kind of been in fights with the Assemblies of God organization. Both of them had kind of pushed the limits in different ways and were distancing themselves from the organization. The organization was distancing themselves from them, not without knowing anything about affairs, without knowing about the fraud. Just the basis of how these two were doing ministry was very much at odds with the history and the culture and the ideals of the Pentecostal Assemblies of God movement. Doesn't mean that there were no Pentecostals or Assemblies of God people that liked Swaggart or Baker or both, but they were at odds. Um, so I won't revisit everything that was noted in the last module. However, my goal there was to show that Pentecostalism is an international movement. At the same time, we will revisit the Pew Study to look at the health and wealth movement that came out of Pentecostal televangelist culture. I'm convinced that Swaggart and Baker are largely responsible for the founding of that movement, and that it is very much an American offshoot of a much larger Pentecostal charismatic movement. Before moving forward with that point, however, I would like to point out a few key theological issues and informational errors in Bloom's book. Number one, I'm not exactly sure how one can say that Paul deprecates speaking in tongues like a true Pharisee. In 1 Corinthians, Paul makes statements like, "Do not forbid anyone to speak in tongues, and I speak in tongues more than you all, and I wish that you all spoke in tongues." I don't see how that's deprecating something. Now, no doubt, church movements since then have frequently deprecated that experience, avoided it, ignored it, shoot it under the rug, or outright come against it. But I don't see how you can look at those statements from the Apostle Paul and say that's deprecation. Um, Pentecostals do distinguish glossolalia and xenoglossy. That's contrary to Bloom's statement that Acts 2 instance of xenoglossy is unique. There are reports of it elsewhere in Christian history and especially in the Pentecostal movement. That's the idea that someone speaks a known human language that they don't know by study. It's given to them miraculously. That's xenoglossy. Glossolalia is the idea that someone's speaking a heavenly language directly to God that's not known by any human. The Pentecostal movement has focused on glossolalia, but there are instances of xenoglossy. And in fact, oddly enough, while Bloom says that's a unique thing from Acts 2, he himself reports on page 172 and on 173 instances of it. So I don't see how he says on 172 he knows no reports. On 173 he mentions a report. Bloom claims the Assemblies of God is most notorious for Bakert and Swaggart and unlikely to become respectable. This was, of course, written in the late 80s, early 90s, I forget which. But the reality was that the Assemblies of God was distancing themselves, like I mentioned, from such popular movements before the scandals. Egos as big as Bakers and Swaggarts do not work well in large institutions. Furthermore, the Assemblies of God is highly respected by many charismatic and evangelical Christians, even those who disagree with their Pentecostal theology, because of very effective organizations like Teen Challenge, which helps with substance abuse, Convoy of Hope, which is very effective in disaster relief. Furthermore, their mission movements, which works with local Christians wherever they work to plant schools and orphanages and medical facilities and churches, with indigenous pastors, as opposed to sending lifelong American staff to places. That's looked at as a model by many groups, even groups who don't like Pentecostalism as such, have great respect for the way the Assemblies of God has done ministry in cultures by very quickly training up and turning over the ministry to people from that culture. As for Seymour, I've read some of the Assemblies of God history written over the last 20 years, and they honor Seymour as essential to the foundation of the movement, and they don't tend to tiptoe around the failure of the early Assemblies of God movement in matters of racial equality. I learned about the problems of racial inequality in the early founding of the Pentecostal movement through books put out by the Assemblies of God on their founding. They've tried to own up to those failures in their material and in their publications. So I can make some other theological observations, but that would take us way too far afield. What I want to focus on in this unit is the development of the prosperity gospel movement, which was born out of the charismatic Pentecostal movement. Arguably, this health and wealth teaching was born of televangelist culture and is a tremendous tool for charismatic figures to capitalize on the faithful. Swaggart was one of the first successful TV evangelists. He preached a typical fire and brimstone message focused on the individual salvation of the hearer. We can't apply the health and wealth label to him per se, but what is significant about Swaggart is how he capitalized on his following with financial appeals, leading to the wealth that funded a ministry empire. His was one of the first to master that tactic. However, it was arguably Baker who fully Americanized his Pentecostal faith. He built a Christian entertainment empire complete with a theme park, shopping mall, and variety show. It was Baker who emphasized the idea that as one gave his ministry, God would give financial blessings. That kind of, if you give, God will give back to you, that you see with way too many televangelists nowadays. From a traditional Christian and traditional Pentecostal background, this was unheard of and blasphemous. Consider many of the Pentecostals in the generation of Baker's parents believed that watching TV was sinful. When the first TV entered homes. So, my grandparents didn't play cards or believe in makeup or women wearing pants. and certainly not shorts or swimsuits or piercings. Going to movies or dances was strictly preached against on a wide scale, even when I was a child, which wasn't that long ago. So the idea that a ministry included a water park was a radical departure from early Pentecostalism, and certainly unlike anything in the wider world of Pentecostal and charismatic movement at that time. Yet, when you take Swiggert's invention of the televangelist method of fundraising and the Baker innovation of Christian theology to embody the American success story, we have the creation of the modern health and wealth gospel. The most popular current embodiment is likely Paula White. White has recently become more famous due to her close ties to President Trump. To clarify, the miraculous was incredibly important from the very beginning of Pentecostalism and the charismatic movement. I've seen things that I can only explain as miracles, and miracle stories are common in the faith worldwide. What is different in this American televangelist culture is the focus on wealth and success. It would seem that the health and wealth offshoot of the charismatic renewal has exchanged its focus on charisms, which is the term for miraculous gifts of power from God, and instead they've substituted charisma, very human personalities that can create a blind following. As for that televangelist American religion, Bloom is correct to place Swaggart at its heart.